Hey everyone, happy today. Hope you're doing well. So, what I'd like to do today is just run through chapter 40. There are just a handful of ideas from chapter 40 that we need to hit in the standards. We really just spend part of a day on chapter 40. There are some questions laid out there. I'd like to just actually go through it with you to sort of make things as expedient and as efficient as possible for you. All right, first we want to look at the connection between anatomy and physiology. Anatomy looks at the structure of an organism, and physiology looks at the function or what it does. And certainly we know there's a connection between structure and function, right? So let's maybe say like surface area of small intestine. Let's see what kind of images we can come up with here. If we look at the small intestine, it has these loops of tissue. They're called circular folds. If we zoom in on them, there are little finger-like structures called villi. And if we zoom in on the villi, there are little hair-like structures called microvilli. So imagine between these folds, these extensions, and then the little hair-like extensions on those extensions, all that is doing is increasing the absorptive surface area for your small intestines. Your small intestines are where you absorb most of your nutrients and a fair amount of water from what we consume. So when you run through this tube, you basically increase the surface area so you can absorb as much material as possible when passing through that. Explain why organisms must be multicellular if they're going to greatly increase in size. Hey, that gets back to surface area to volume ratio, right? As cells get bigger and bigger and bigger, volume, the denominator, increases faster than surface area, the numerator. So the surface area to volume ratio drops. So as cells get bigger, surface area to volume ratio drops. The cells become less efficient. So if you're going to have organisms get bigger, it has to be by adding a bunch of little cells. We're made of trillions of cells. Alrighty. Looking here, this is just sort of a generic set of body systems for some sort of generic animal. But 3 says, explain the value of interstitial fluid in moving materials through an organism. Interstitial fluid, inter means between. Interstitial fluid is the fluid between cells. Okay. So we know life requires water, right? You have to have water within cells and you have to have water between cells. So interstitial fluid is that water between cells. So it is a liquid medium through which materials move into and out of cells. So when we think about export of materials from cells, and where the heck does that stuff go? Those materials, when they get released from cells, it goes into this interstitial fluid. Now, sort of depending on the organism, things are going to happen differently, right? So here we have interstitial fluid, here we have our cells, and then we also have plasma, which is the fluid in blood. So if you can imagine, you eat breakfast or lunch, you digest that, you absorb it through your small intestines into your bloodstream, and then the nutrients travel through the bloodstream all around our body. Well, materials traveling through the bloodstream can then pass through interstitial fluid into cells, and the reverse can happen with like waste products. So waste products can be released from cells through the interstitial fluid and then sort of into the highway of our bloodstream and travel all over the body. So interstitial fluid is that sort of fluid that fills the space between cells, and it provides a medium or a material through which substances can pass through the body. So that's handy. Let's see. Number 4, explain the relationship between the circulatory system and the respiratory system. So here's the idea of a circulatory system. You can have open or closed circulatory systems, but let's look at the example of a closed circulatory system here that is basically a series of tubes. So in our bodies, we've got about 60,000 miles of blood vessels. So you have these tiny, tiny little tubes traveling all over the body. And what they do is circulate blood. And blood, think of it as a river of life. It carries materials through it. So again, we just talked about eating lunch, right? If you eat lunch and digest those nutrients and then absorb them into your bloodstream, you've got 60,000 miles of blood vessels delivering materials to 10 trillion cells. So you have these roads that run right up against cells, and the value of the circulatory system is to basically rapidly transmit materials to the body. You've got about 5 liters of blood. and you have about 60,000 miles of blood vessels, and you pump all through 5 liters through all 60,000 miles in about a minute. So your body is unbelievably efficient at transporting materials all over the place. Now your respiratory system provides, an exchange interface, if you want to think of it that way. So you need oxygen for cellular respiration, right? And we produce carbon dioxide as a waste gas. We got to get it out of the body. So your respiratory system has all these subdivisions, and you can see how it's closely intertwined with your circulatory system. So if you, again, think about structure and function, if you take all these little chambers in your lungs and flatten them out, it's approximately equivalent to the surface area of a tennis court. So if you think about a huge tennis court, our lungs have that much surface area to exchange an extraordinary amount of gases with each breath. So with each breath you take in, you're actually breathing in so many molecules, you're virtually guaranteed to be breathing in at least one molecule of carbon dioxide that's been expelled by every other human being that's ever lived. There are about 110 billion people that have ever existed, and you're breathing in carbon dioxide molecules exhaled by at least every one of them with each breath you take in. So unbelievable amount of gases get exchanged with each breath, and that's made possible by the surface area there. So the lungs perform the gas exchange, then the gases are circulated through the blood to cells in just this rapid transit of materials to the body. So how you're set up and how you run is absolutely remarkable. Number 5, explain how amino acids from the proteins you eat get to the target cells shown in the figure. Well, that's sort of what we've discussed, right? Here you have a mouth, you digest the food, then in our small intestines, you absorb that food into your bloodstream, your heart pumps that blood to your cells, and then materials travel through interstitial fluid to the cells, and then under the direction of your DNA, you assemble those amino acids into the proteins of you. So you can eat proteins in like a soy chicken nugget, but then you can break it down and rearrange it into proteins of hair or skin or muscles or whatever the case may be. So that's handy. Number 6, explain why large multicellular organisms may need systems like the circulatory system and digestive system. Well, if you're made of trillions of cells, you can't wait for diffusion, right? Diffusion just takes too long. So certain organisms can actually just have materials diffused through them, right? But us, since we're relatively thick, you need a circulatory system to carry those materials. Excuse me for just a moment. I got to pause and take a phone call. All right. Hey, thanks for your patience with this. Let's look at number 7. Describe the general structure and function of muscle. Let's see. Okay, so we learned first about actin and myosin, looking how those two proteins help sort of ratchet membranes during cell division, right? But there's also an interaction in muscle contraction. So let's look at these images that we have here. And actually, let's start with this one. If we look first at this image, here you have the muscle that can contract, right? Oh, geez. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. We have the muscle that can contract. And if you zoom in on that contracting muscle, you see it's just a series of all these actin and myosin proteins. So the myosin is the thicker protein and the actin is the thinner protein. Now, what will happen with this is if we zoom in on just the actin and myosin, you'll see that myosin has those myosin heads that will row and pull on actin. When they pull on actin, like what you see in red and blue here, it pulls the proteins closer together and the muscles contract. Now, when looking at that, we see that the myosin heads row and pull on actin, but they do that, they perform that shape change when there is ATP. So when ATP is present, the myosin head detaches from actin, extends, reattaches, and then rows. So what you have to do is continuously supply the myosin heads with ATP so they will detach, extend, reattach, and row. And that repeated rowing shortens the muscle. Now, think about what happens if you, lack ATP. If you lack ATP, then what happens is the myosin head stays stuck to actin, and then they're locked in place. So I'm guessing you've heard of like rigor mortis. With rigor mortis, an animal's muscles are like locked in position and it's stiff. Well, that happens because when the organism dies, it stops making ATP. If the organism stops making ATP, then the myosin heads stay stuck to actin, and then those filaments, those proteins, are locked in place, and then the muscles become rigid. Okay? So as long as we have ATP, we can keep that rowing happening. We can make muscles contract. So when people are like lifting heavy weights, you lift all those weights, then you're going to run short on oxygen for ATP production. You start to run short on ATP, well, then the muscles aren't going to be able to contract and they'll fatigue. So you have to have, recovery time in between sets of, weights to lift so you can generate ATP and get those muscles contracting again. Alrighty. Number 8, the general structure and function of nervous tissue. We'll get into that in a lot more detail in another chapter. We don't give muscle its own stuff. So in terms of structure and function of nervous tissue, you basically have neurons communicate with one another through chemicals, and then that causes electrical changes in the neurons to send the message on rapidly. So nervous system signaling is a combination of chemical and electrical signaling. And again, we'll get into that in greater detail later. 9, similarities and differences between the endocrine and nervous systems. Now, your endocrine system, that's your hormonal signaling system. So your endocrine system has hormones released into blood vessels, and then they travel all over the body, and then those hormones are detected by receptors on cell surfaces. So hormones travel all over the body, but just dock on receptors on target cells. The nervous system is more precise. You have sort of prescribed routes of electrical signals that are carried through the wires of the nervous system. So again, we'll talk about that more in other chapters. Number 10, the difference between regulators and conformers. Conformers sort of conform to the environmental conditions of their environment. So ectothermic organisms, their body temperature will match their environment. Osmoconformers, like sponges, the salinity of their cells matches the marine environment or the ocean water around them. Regulators, on the other hand, keep constant conditions. Thermoregulators, like endothermic organisms like us, maintain a steady body temperature. Osmoregulators will control the salinity of the tissues in their body. Again, think of like our kidneys controlling the osmolarity of our blood. So regulators maintain steady conditions. Conformers have their conditions sort of match that of their environments. 11, set point, stimulus, sensor, and response. Describe how negative feedback helps you maintain homeostasis. Okay, so this is all related to body temperature. So we have a certain set point for body temperature, and what will happen is a certain stimulus can cause our body temperature to change. So if it's cold outside, you've been active and your muscles are generating heat, whatever the case may be. And then we have sensors that detect those temperature changes in the hypothalamus at the base of our brain, and then we can respond in different ways, whether it's through behavioral changes or changes in metabolism or sweating, whatever the case may be. And what that does is it brings your temperature back to that set point. Okay. Differences between endotherms and ectotherms. Therms related to temperature. Ectotherms, ecto means outside of, right? So ectotherms have body temperature that, again, matches their environment. So if an organism is ectothermic, what's the advantage to that? Well, the deal is if you're ectothermic, you're not putting any energy into maintaining body temperature, so it takes a lot less energy. So ectotherms benefit from having lower metabolic requirements. Endotherms, you're putting energy into systems that help you maintain body temperature. So that's metabolically expensive, but it also helps you be active at times of year or in places where ectotherms can't, right? So we're endothermic. We maintain our body temperature, but that comes at a metabolic cost, right? We have to consume more energy. But again, we're active all winter, right? And we can live in places that are colder because of that investment. means of thermoregulation. How can you help keep temperature steady in organisms? Well, again, that can be behavioral things like, you can have lizards go and sun themselves on rocks. That includes things like conduction, where if you're up against something warm, you have the transfer of heat into tissue. Convection with the movement of air, that can help with thermoregulation. Since we have a circulatory system, we can alter the flow of blood in our bodies. So if you are being active and you're generating a lot of heat, you have to dissipate that heat. So one thing we can do is sweat, right? And sweat evaporates, that cools us off. We can also have blood vessels in our skin dilate. If you have blood vessels in your skin dilate, that brings more heat to the surface, and that heat radiates out and cools you off. That's also related to like jackrabbits and how they help dissipate heat. So if you look at the ears of a jackrabbit, they got these big old ears that certainly help them hear, but they're also radiators that help them cool off. You see blood vessels traveling through here. Those blood vessels carry heat to the surface of their body, and then they can dissipate that heat. What else? Oh, countercurrent exchange is an interesting one. If we look at countercurrent exchange and temperature, arteries carry blood from the heart, so that tends to be deeper in the body, and so that's warmer. And then veins travel near the surface, so they tend to be a little cooler. So what happens is arteries and veins tend to run in opposite directions right next to one another. So because arteries and veins run in opposite directions next to one another, the warmer blood in the arteries can transfer heat to the cooler blood in the veins, and that helps retain heat within the body. So, how can birds survive like freezing cold temperatures when they have these little spindly legs? Well, the countercurrent exchange helps with that, because the warmer blood in the arteries is transferred to the blood returning from the veins, and that helps maintain or retain that heat. So here, if we look at this, with countercurrent flow or countercurrent exchange, the warmer material, the warmer blood passes to the returning venous blood, and that helps keep the heat in the core of the body. And actually, my dad's a mechanical engineer, and he works for a company that designs the heating and feeding systems for those big chicken houses, coop things with tens of thousands of birds. So one thing he did a number of years ago was he designed the most efficient heating system in the world for these chicken coops. And what he basically did was use this idea of countercurrent exchange. So he took something that biological systems have evolved, and they just had the ductwork go across like that so they can keep the heat in the appropriate part of the chicken house. So it's something that's called biomimetics. With biomimetics, you basically look at what evolution has sort of crafted as solutions for issues, and then you design mechanical systems that sort of mimic what nature has already done. So that's a cool area of biology. If you're interested in building and making things, but you also like biology, biomimetics is really cool, because you sort of take examples from nature and then you build stuff to sort of mimic that and solve problems. A number of years ago, Purdue created like a marine glue, a glue that can be set underwater. And what they basically did was model it after molecules produced by barnacles. Barnacles can adhere themselves to like the hulls of ships and to rocks and stuff like that. So they basically create like a biological glue that helps hold them in place. And the people at Purdue were like, if barnacles can do it, can't we make a similar molecule to create a glue that holds underwater? So again, you can really create all sorts of potential solutions to problems just by looking at what nature has already done. So that's pretty cool. The role of the hypothalamus in fever. There are systems for the body to sort of reset its temperature or its set point. So if you have cells of your immune system recognize that there are pathogens in the body, they can release molecules called pyrogens, Pyrogens then go to the hypothalamus and tell the hypothalamus, you know what, we need to raise the set point of the body a little bit, and it makes the body run warmer. By increasing the temperature of the body, that increases the sort of kinetic energy in the body. It makes reactions happen faster, and the body tries to heal itself a little faster. Let's see, relationship between mass and metabolic rate. This is sort of a funky one. I had to look for a graph that I thought was helpful with this. So if you look at metabolic rate in relation to overall body size, as organisms get bigger and bigger and bigger, well, their metabolic needs increase, right? Which makes sense. If you're a big organism, you're going to need more calories to maintain that bigger body. But what's sort of fascinating about this is that if you look at the metabolic needs per gram of tissue, or I think in this case per kilogram of tissue, as organisms get bigger and bigger, the actual cellular needs of individual cells or metabolic demands decrease. And that's because bigger is more efficient. If you're big, you can generate and retain more heat. And so your metabolic demands for individual cells aren't as great because they've got the energy, the radiant energy of all the chemical reactions of all the other cells surrounding them. That's a sort of a fascinating relationship. Let's see. Finally, the relationships between torpor, hibernation, and estivation. Torpor is a drop in metabolism and a corresponding drop in body temperature. So organisms may drop their metabolism, so the chemical reactions are happening more slowly. Of course, that's going to reduce heat, but it's a way of basically trying to slow down chemical reactions in the body to maintain survival in the absence of food. Okay, so extended torpor is what we typically think of as hibernation, right? So during cold months, winter months, when food is less available, water is less available, organisms may reduce their metabolic rate and then live off of that bat tissue, that brown adipose tissue or fat, and use that to generate enough heat to stay alive. But again, it just sort of consumes its fatty tissue while it's resting. Estivation is basically summer torpor. Estivation happens during the summer, and that in essence is like when it's too hot. If it's too hot, then organisms try to just survive by chilling out. They just lay there and try to generate as little heat as possible. So the organisms aren't very active during the day. You know, if you're going to go to the zoo, go first thing in the morning when it opens. First thing in the morning, the animals are up and active. As it gets hotter during the day, they're just like, you know what? I'm just going to hang out here, and they become less active. So there we go. That's chapter 40 in a nutshell. Thanks for sticking with it, and I hope you have a great day.